Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to briefly introduce our guest today, Núria Bosch. She's a third-year PhD student in linguistics at the University of Cambridge. Her doctoral thesis focuses on syntax and first language acquisition. In particular, on the concept of categorical granularity in language acquisition and language change, drawing on novel morphosyntactic and phonological case studies. She is interested in how children construct grammatical systems and how this process can shed light on synchronic and diachronic variation. Her work is based on the so-called neo-emergentist generative approach to language acquisition and generative variation, which was developed in Cambridge by Teresa Bibeaua and her colleagues, and is based on a maximally reduced universal grammar. I mean, just for introduction.
Yes.
A fundamental shift has taken place within generative linguistics, away from an approach based on a rich, innate syntax with detailed grammatical rules, towards the assumption that where there are only a limited number of basic mechanisms for assembling structures. And this basic idea is that the innate language faculty is reduced to an absolute bare minimum necessary to enable language acquisition and is restricted to basic operations like merge, rather than complex language-specific modules. No innate parameters, no innate features, no innate cartographic spines. The main aspects of this radical approach are neo-emergentism rather than innatism and biolinguistics, feature economy and feature generalization. The data are collected using corpus methods and multilingual data analysis to evaluate theoretical approaches to grammar construction. Most of Núria's research so far has focused on the acquisition of functional categories cross-linguistically, especially the left periphery of the sentence. She has also studied expletive subjects, negation, and expressive language. During her PhD, she gave numerous presentations at prestigious linguistic conferences, and we are very delighted that she has taken the time to join us at the Conversazioni Linguistiche in Trento.
Thank you.
Please, and the title of your presentation is Motivating Categorial Granularity in Syntactic Acquisition, a New Argument from Bilingualism. Please.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and let me share the screen. No, the other one. Yeah, it's the other one. Okay, perfect. I assume everyone online can see the screen. If not, please, I guess, say. So I think Edmund actually did a lot of my broad introduction for me to some extent. But yeah, so I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be looking a lot at the left periphery and the acquisition of functional categories. So the categories that form up the trees and the sentences that we think are part of how we construct utterances, etc. And I'm going to try to make a case, an argument for the importance of an understudied formal notion that exists in a lot of places in theoretical syntax, but that hasn't really been incorporated a lot in questions in syntactic acquisition, which is this notion of categorial granularity, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about. And I'm going to first make a broad case, empirical case for this using monolingual data and some bilingual data primarily. But then in the second part, I'm going to choose various kinds of bilingual data. So bilinguals acquiring different languages. And then we're going to see whether we can find new arguments for the data I'm going to present. And this is because the presentation here it's largely based on old data that I've collected and presented elsewhere, and very new data that I've actually not presented anywhere. So it's a bit of a combination of old things and new things, and seeing if we can find new data for other arguments we've sort of presented in our work. Hello. Yeah, so just to let me see if I can okay. So yeah, so I'm going to start with a broad introduction about what this notion of granularity is, so that way everyone is up to date. So if you're more or less familiar with the generative approach to syntax, you will have seen that if you look at the trees that syntacticians use to characterize human sentences, they may vary quite a bit in how rich or elaborate they are, right? So this is the example in one is a very pared down minimalist VP, TP, CP spine that has the 3 glottal domains that syntacticians typically work with, whereas the one on the right is one of the many examples that you can take from cartographic approaches that have said actually each of these 3 domains that you see here can actually be broken down into more projections that are more fine-grained and encode more subtle, right? So what you can see here is basically that functional sequences grow across approaches, and this typically reflects a change in how we conceive of features and their role in how we build structure, and also how much we understand of the different syntactic domains. And so we consider there's been a change in the granularity of analysis towards more fine-grained sequences. And a great example of this, as I've said, is cartography, which previously taken to be primitive domains with a single head, like the C domain, and say, actually, we can split this up into more fine-grained divisions that actually allow us to capture some variation in natural language much better. So this is the broad idea, and we can phrase it more formally in the following way, just so that it's clear what I mean by granularity. It's just simply this idea that we can take a set of categories that are related to each other, say, for example, force, topic, focus, fin in the cartographic left periphery, and say these are all kinds of C heads or C categories, so categories that are related to the CP domain, or just take a single C category, say, there's a notion of C domain, but we can split it up into finer grained categories. This is just what I've said, but just put formally for reference, really. And there's a question that we can ask here, which is, well, why do we pick one functional sequence or another? Is this an analytical choice? Are they compatible or incompatible levels of explanation and representation? So which one do we want to pick? And what is relevant for me here is, well, which of these functional sequences here, if any of them, are the ones that we think are real in language acquisition? So which kinds of sequences do we think that kids are working with, basically? Hello. And so this is the question that I'm going to ask, which is, how do kids acquire functional sequences? And just to give you a brief background of what the research today, a very brief background of what the research today has said, is there's been a lot of focus on 2 main questions, which is a question of how early do kids acquire different functional domains? So for instance, how early do they acquire the CP domain? How early do they acquire the CP domain, etc.? And there's also been a question of directionality, which is, okay, independent of whether something is acquired early or late, do we spot a specific order in which things are acquired? So say, is the tree acquired in a way that goes from the things that are lower down in the tree to the things that are higher up, or is it some other way? Is there actually no, is it more random? And there's been 2 main broad strands of literature that have answered these questions in different ways. So what are called continuity approaches, basically, as the name implies, say, well, the kid has a continuous grammar with adults. They have access to more or less what adults have access to. So these approaches, simplifying quite a bit, largely predict access to basically all of the functional categories that kids have access to, more or less. So you might predict an early awareness of the CP domain, for example, or at least some early knowledge of the different functional domains. Whereas maturational approaches take a different stance and have said that there's gradual, typically bottom-up development of functional categories. So basically, if we assume that we've got, say, a very simplified, we've got a VP, TP, CP spine, maturational approaches have typically said kids are going to acquire this in a bottom-up way. So at first you acquire the VP, then the TP, and then the CP. So these approaches generally predict universally late CP structures, or some of them should be late, as we'll see. So one very recent version of this that is a particularly strong version of maturation is a very influential proposal by Friedman and colleagues, which is the growing trees hypothesis, which says actually acquisition timing correlates not just with height in a tree, it correlates with the height in a cartographic tree, in a very fine-grained tree, which is to say that it makes very specific predictions about which kinds of CP structures the kid is going to acquire. And that is, and we'll see why. So in figure 1, you can see, hopefully it's more or less legible, but I'll read it out. So in stage 1, which they set aside for their paper, they work mostly, they say, well, there's an initial stage where the kid has to acquire the verbal and the tense domains. At this stage, there's no representation at all of the CP domains. They don't have any awareness that there's a CP domain at all. This matures at a later stage, and it matures in 2 steps because they have this cartographic left periphery here that is split up into different heads, right? So in stage 2, which is kind of the intermediate stage after stage 1, they acquire everything from fin phrase until question phrase. So in this stage 2 is where they predict things like double-H questions to start being acquired. But it's only until a later stage, which is stage 3, that everything else matures, so it develops, which would be things from topic phrase until pause phrase. So here is where they predict embedding, complementizers, topicalization, relative clause markers to start emerging in the kid state, right? So the point in this work is that by virtue of using a very fine-grained spine, it makes very clear predictions about which kinds of structures should be earlier or later, because the lower the things are in the cartographic left periphery, the earlier they should be produced, and the higher they are, the later they should be produced. So what I'm going to do in this talk is focus on an assumption that I think has gone a bit implicit in acquisition approaches to date, which is what I'm going to call this notion of fixed granularity, which is by virtue of the fact that approaches typically work with a single functional spine. So for example, the one you have here, which we assume is part of universal grammar. These approaches have typically entertained the idea that at all stages, children's representations will be described by either a part of what we have here or the whole tree. So at no point is a cat tree that the child have going to be different from what you have here. The child is only going to entertain cat trees that are in this spine, nothing else. And so this idea of granularity. Whatever the kid has is either going to be a part of this or the whole thing whenever they acquire an adult-like structure. So there's this idea of fixed granularity. There's another way of putting it, which is the kids don't actually learn any representations or any cat trees as such. Universal grammar provides them the whole list, and so that's the only thing they take into account. So there's a question that we can ask you, which is it the case, as people tend to assume right now, that the kid gets the kid's tree gets bigger as they get older, but really the tree is the same. The only thing that changes is how much of it they're making use of. The tree doesn't change; it's the same thing. So is it the case that we've got a bigger tree, but how rich the tree is really the same? It's only how much of it they're using, or is there other ways of maybe thinking about development that could be interesting? So what I'm going to argue here is that this assumption, while logically possible, it only really follows theory internally by virtue of the fact that we've put a given spine in universal grammar. And at the very least, it hides an unexplored question that it might be worth thinking about, or at least probing empirically. And that's what I'm going to call a question of granularity, which is going to be how rich are children's representations at various developmental stages. So in other words, do we always have evidence to be assuming something as rich as this? Should we be assuming something else? If we have evidence that kids do indeed have access to something as rich as this, then this theory might work very well. If not, then maybe we can look for other alternatives, for example. And this talk is going to be about the importance of considering tree, which hasn't really been considered. So this is going to be a talk about studying how richly articulated, how much knowledge the kids really have about their left periphery, even if they already have access to it. How elaborate is that knowledge? So the main takeaways are going to be the following, which I'm going to obviously go into a lot of detail about, but it's going to be 2 studies. All the data that is based on, well, new support for an older generalization of mine in my master's, which I'm basically trying to expand with more data so that I know that the generalization is robust. So it's based on Catalan, Spanish, Italian, German, and Dutch data from Childers data. So monolingual data primarily with some Catalan and Spanish bilinguals. And I'm going to show you that there's a range of evidence showing that the CP emerges early, also in a way that doesn't seem to map onto structural height, as we'll see. It's evidence that the kid is actually making use of more than one lay in the left periphery, so that they know that their lay, say in Italian, has more than one head, actually comes in rather late. And so we're going to have to ask the question, why is that? And then study 2 is going to look at bilinguals, and I'm going to show you that actually the generalization manifests a bit differently with regard to how much they produce these structures that give evidence to a cartographic CP. We're going to see what that means, but the point is that there's going to be some underproduction in only some bilinguals, but not all of them. And so we're going to have to see how do we predict different patterns of production in different bilinguals acquiring different languages. I'm going to try to argue that we can understand both patterns here if we take this notion of granularity, so in other words, how rich functional sequences are, not to be something that, this one sequence that all languages make use of, but rather that this is something that might be a matter of cross-linguistic variation. So it might be very well supported, for example, in Romance languages, but a lot of people, at least going back as far back as Georgian PNSC, for example, have argued that perhaps not all languages actually make use of the whole sequence, and some languages might just have a much simpler structure. And then having argued this, well, having assumed this, I'm going to say, well, we might expect this to play a role in acquisition if this is the case. If kids have to be acquiring how rich their functional sequence is, even if they have some, I guess, very basic innate knowledge of a template or something, you might expect this to play a role in acquisition if this is no longer innate, right? And I'm going to argue that the development actually involves increases in how elaborate children's trees are. So we start off with more basic trees, say a single C head, before the kids actually work out what is going on. So this is the roadmap, as I said. So part one is going to be the motivating why it is that granularity might matter in acquisition. So give you an empirical case study that shows that some patterns seem to be best accounted for if we make use of this notion of finer grained or coarser grained trees, as opposed to just having a single unified tree for all stages. And then once I've at least sort of tried to convince you that this might be interesting, I'm going to give you some new evidence from bilinguals that might also point back to this notion of granularity, hopefully. So this is part one, as I said. So this builds on, so study 1A is going to be a summary of my master's work, and study 1B is basically going to be a corroboration of the master's work, just to check that we had the same patterns in a bigger sample, because the master's data was 10 kids, which is something, but not that much. And as I said, I looked at Catalan, Spanish, Italian, German, and Dutch. I'm going to focus a lot on Romance here, but I will talk a bit about the Germanic data. And I expanded this with 11 new kids, 6 Catalan, Spanish, and Italian monolingual, so 2 kids per language, and then 5 Catalan and Spanish bilinguals, so all from Childers. And the 2 studies follow the same methodology, so I'm only going to summarize it once. And I also have the adult data, which I don't have time to talk much about here, but you're very welcome to ask me about this if this is of interest. So this is the kids that I have. What sort of questions am I going to ask, bearing in mind the theoretical background that I've given you of what theories think about the development of the left periphery. So one question that I'm going to ask is a very long-standing one, which is there evidence of the CP early or late? This has been debated for a long time. We want to check how early are any kind of CP structures acquired in the child production. And then secondly, I'm going to ask another question, which is the finer grain question that Freeman and colleagues have proposed in the growing trees, which is actually, besides having evidence of, is there a correlation between how low in the left periphery CP structures are and how early acquired or not early acquired they are? And what they suggest is that the higher they are in the left periphery, so things like complementizers, topics, embedding, should be emerging late. So this is the case. And then thirdly, when do children show evidence? Besides knowing that the kids have a CP, when can I, based on the empirical data, at least say I have some evidence that they're using more than one layer? And as you can see here, the 3 questions for us, the 3 points here correspond to the 3 questions that I gave you at the start, right? Is the CP early acquired or not? Is there a given directionality in which things are acquired? And then what do we do with this notion of granularity? And maybe we can explore what we haven't really explored yet. So the way I'm going to implement these different research questions is by introducing a new distinction in different things that I'm going to be looking for. So I'm going to look for a set of diagnostics that just give me evidence for this is something that we would locate in the CP. Therefore, they might have some knowledge of the CP. And this is all the things that you might think about, so which questions, topics. I'm going to give examples in a second. And then there's another set of diagnostics, which are basically going to be co-occurrence of 2 CP structures, so combinations of CP structures. So here I can see that the kid is combining 2 things in the left periphery. Therefore, I might have evidence that there's more than one layer being used. So that's what I'm going to call the split CP diagnostics. And here's a list. It looks a lot scarier than it actually is. I've made a list just to be exhaustive, but for the CP domain, I'm doing, I think, relatively standard things. So things like in Germanic languages, when do the kids know that they have to raise the verb to second position? WH questions, yes, no questions, various kinds of fronted objects like topicalizations and vocalizations, some kinds of complementizers in, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Some kinds of complementizers in Romance that I'll discuss in a bit, and then any kind of finite embedding structures. And then for the split CP, there'll basically be any logically possible, grammatically possible combinations of the first set of diagnostics. So the most common ones are going to be the first 2 and the first 3. Most notably things like topics preceding a WH element, so things like this. So Julia, where has she gone? This is very common in Romance languages. So La Julia on an act. This is in Catalan. In Italian, it would be something like recursive topics or recursive or topics and photos. So this thing to you, it scares you. So there's 2 things in the left periphery. And then you can also have other things in Spanish, like que cuánto te han costado, which is literally something like that how much have they cost you? So there's a complementizer, which question is it. So literally anything that has two things in the left periphery, I would be taking note of. So why are these diagnostics useful? Well, the first set of diagnostics helps us tease apart predictions with respect to how early are the CP structures. So if I see a CP diagnostic early on, perhaps I want to say that the TNT approaches are more supported. If I see them very late, then perhaps lots of maturation approaches work better. And then the second set of diagnostics explicitly takes the notion of granularity as something that we should study, as opposed to take it as a theoretical prior, something that we take for granted, basically. So it's another way of testing to test how we understand syntactic development by seeing if this notion of granularity is something that is real in development, basically. And so if this notion of fixed granularity is correct in principle, and there's going to be a big if here, but we should expect no differences between the two sets of diagnostics, because if, say, kids have access to the full cartography, the kids should be able to make use of the different layers. Unless, and this is a big one that I'm going to come back to, any differences that we see can be attributed to confounds, like processing or things like that I'm going to discuss. I hope that this is more or less clear. If there are important questions, feel free to interrupt me, I should have said. But what do we find in the data? So we find a first stage, which is a range of a varied range of CP structures are tested early on. So what are these CP structures? These are quite varied. So in Romance, they are things like double-edged questions, some cases of fronted objects, typically without a clitic. So clitic-less dislocation is a bit late. Illocutory complementizers that, as I said, I'm going to go back to. And then in Germanic, there would be things like a range of things. So evidence that the verb moves to the second position, double-edged questions, yes, no questions, and also topicalization of objects, adverbials, and things that are not subjects as well. So I'm going to put these graphically all the time with the, hopefully it's more or less, I didn't realize, hopefully it's more or less visible from here, but I'll explain what these are. So what I've done is I've taken every diagnostic and I've put it in a symbol and basically said, here's when its diagnostic emerges for the kid. And what I've put in dark blue are embedding structures, because we know that kids take a while to produce subordinate clauses. So I'm just taking those to be a bit different because we know these are late. So I'm going to use them more or less as a way of telling how late things considering that embedding tends to emerge later, at least finite embedding. So what we see is that we typically, so the cross are double-edged questions, the triangle are the illocutory complementars that I'm going to discuss, and then the diamond is our topicalization and focalization mixed together. Typically, these are things like fronted objects without a clitic. And so what we see that the first things often before H2 are things like double-edged questions, the complementizers, some kinds of post-IN topics, but not very often. And then later you end up finding the embedding structures. So this is what you find in the master's data. For the Romance children, for the Germanic children, it's similar. So B2 is found very early. Evidence that they raise the verb is found very early on, double-edged questions as well. Cases of fronted objects and adverbials in the first position are also found very often. Yes, no questions or things like that, whereas embedding is always pretty late, which is not surprising. The kids typically produce embedding late. So we know that a range of things are early. In the master's data, this is the new data, which is pretty much shows the same thing. So there's a lot of variation here because there's always a lot of child individual variation. So the reason I'm not talking too much about age, I'm not going to talk about it too much, is because as you can sort of see here, kids vary a lot as to when they produce things. And that's just because some kids are faster, some kids are slower. So I can't really be using age as a metric. I have to be using a more relative thing, like when are they producing double-edged questions, say relative to embedding, which we know is a late development. So here we find, again, double-edged questions early on, illocutory complementars in some cases, some kinds of fronted objects as well, and then embedding tends to pop up a bit later. Yes.
This is only for Romance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I should have said this. I'm not gonna. Well, these are all. These are the new kids that I've collected, which are all. These are all Catalan, Spanish, or Italian monolinguals here, and these are all Catalan and Spanish bilinguals. So there's no Germanic data here yet. And I can't give you the full data because so these are all. This is more like qualitative data. Here's when different things emerge. We want to know, hopefully, that these are productive and they're not rote learn. I've tried to ensure that these are not repetitions or these are not possible rote learn formula, just so you have basically an idea of how many they produce before they start producing more complex things. there's a fair amount of things that are being produced. It's not obvious to me that any of these are obviously rote. So just so you know, I've also controlled for things like how productive are these structures. I can't give you the full data because I don't have time, but just so you know. So yes, so these are I take this to be some good evidence that some CP structures are acquired very early. I think implicit in what I've told you is that these CP structures don't tend to be particularly located in a specific area of the left periphery. So I've shown you a range of graphs that show early CP structures that don't have to be particularly structurally low. So some structures are very high, like topics in Germanic. So in most approaches, topics in Germanic would be in force, which is the highest set in the left periphery. Those are still acquired early. And illocutory complementizers, which are, these are interesting complementizers. So they're a kind of complementizer, mostly in Catalan and Spanish. They exist in Italian, but much less commonly, where it's the same complementizer in embedded clauses. So this one here, which is que or ca in Catalan. And we can put it in main clauses to add a range of discourse or illocutory functions. So typically exclamation. And this would be something like, these sentences say something like, that I don't want to, but really this is just an exclamated version of I don't want to. I'm just really emphasizing that I don't want to do something. And these kinds of structures are produced very early by the kids. And at least standardly, these structures are analyzed in Catalan and Spanish as being very high in the left periphery, also in fours or even potentially higher heads. So these are just evidence both from German, in this case, and Catalan and Spanish in this other case, that there's a range of things that are early acquired that don't seem to be particularly low in the left periphery, right? And they also tested early in Romanian, which is nice. Is a nice data set as well, as early as very low mean length of utterances. So when the kids are only producing 1 or 2 words. So we see that Bianca produces it without verbs in 48 and 49, but in 40, she also produces it with verbs. So she's saying, no, that we're going outside. And again, with an exclamation. No, she's basically saying, no, I'm telling you that we're going outside, whatever you want to do, basically. And these kinds of things seem to be acquired early by the kids. So, okay, what I've shown you so far is not something that I think to be particularly new. I think the illocutory complementizer is probably the newest data, but I think this brings new data that supports existing ideas. I think the generalization that CP structures may be early is there. So it's been there since continuity approaches. There's also a lot of work that's shown WH questions are comprehended very early on by kids. And there's a lot of work showing that verb second is acquired early in a range of Germanic languages. And similarly for topics and foci. And if you care about interaction language, so in expressive language, which some people locate in the left periphery, there's some work that shows some interactional particles like sentence final particles or question text are also acquired early. So if that's something that you believe that interaction language is located high in the left periphery, then this would be additional evidence for it. So in other words, I've given you new data for generalization that I think has been noted so far. And similarly, there's the one, it's not more novel, but this idea that CP structures don't have to be particularly low to be acquired early, I think it's implicit in the list that I've given you here, because topics can be acquired early and they are structurally high, similarly with the illocutory complementizers, right? So I take this to mean we have some representation of the CP in place early on, whatever that is, but we have to ask the question now, given my diagnostics, how elaborate do we think this early representation is? So I have some evidence to be saying we have to postulate a CP, but what kind of CP? How elaborate is this CP at this stage? And the point is that it is only the second stage that these CP structures emerge, and they emerge rather late and rather abruptly, as we'll see. So the original observation in the masters is that these diagnostics are a consistently late phenomenon. So if I put you the first age at which they produce any kind of CP diagnostic here, and the first stage at which they produce the first CP structure, there's usually a 1 year or 6 month gap, which is pretty significant as far as production is concerned. So we have to ask, why is this the case? And so again, I'm putting this table into a graph so that it's clearer. So this is the graph that I've shown you. I'm going to stick the split CP stub in green, and you can see that this is the latest thing that is produced, and often after embedding, which we know is late acquired. And in some kids, in fact, there's several months after embedding. So this is the Romance children from the master study. This is the new data. We have the same patterns. The green stuff is late, and we don't exactly know why yet.
Sorry, the
yes.
one that appeared before, the fourth one, no, the next slide, the fourth child in the last one, that the green dot is
This one?
no, maybe the fifth.
Oh, this one, yeah. So Marco's interesting. Yeah, I'm familiar with Marco. Yeah, so he's there's two kids. So there's Albert and Juan, and I'm sorry, Marco. They produce almost all of the structures at the same time. So I can't tell actually how early they've acquired it because they produce all of them at once. So they're both very early talkers. So it's a bit uninformative because I can't tell. If I had earlier recordings, I would have been able to tell, did they actually have these as soon as they start speaking? Or because, I mean, from the first file, they have a lot, they're saying a lot. So it could well be that I'm just not seeing stages that they, but yes, it's a great question. So these two, I have it in a footnote. These two are early talkers, and so not necessarily the most informative kids. But ideally, we would want to get both kids and get their full, which I don't have, obviously, get their full file, their full data, and see whether they actually show more stages when we have the whole data set. But yes, yeah. So this is more qualitative. When do the things emerge? Quantitatively, it's also interesting to note that these structures emerge. They don't emerge linearly, so they don't gradually emerge. They go from not existing to being produced very frequently. Here's just a table that I've put an arbitrary age as a threshold. You don't really need to worry about it. But the point is that we go from seeing none of these structures in all of the kids to seeing hundreds of them. So this is interesting because it's a pretty categorical change. And if you put it graphically, it's very clear, right? So the first half, we see basically nothing, and then suddenly there's all of them. This is an interesting change. Yeah, exactly. There's an explosive and very abrupt change that it's somewhat unusual if we're suggesting that these kids should have knowledge of these structures at any point in development, right? And now, if I put it individually, it's also very clear. So obviously, this is aggregate. So I'm compiling all the kids. But if I get all the kids, obviously there's variation. The lines are a bit squiggly because this is scopus data. But typically, you have this kind of L-shaped curve where the kids go from not having anything to suddenly producing all of them. As I said, there's a lot of variation in Marco, as you can see. There's a lot of them from the start, but this is typically what you see. So this is interesting. And so it supports the same patterns that I had in the master's. Where I propose this generalization, which now continues to hold with 11 new kids, which is the following, this is something that I phrased in a way that sounds quite theory loaded, but I intend in a descriptive way, not particularly theory loaded. So I put it here as cartography is emergent in the sense that structures that give us evidence for cartographic-like structure seem to emerge late, and in a way that elaborates on structures that have, there are expressions that have been there very early on, but they don't seem to be able to combine them together until a later stage. So what do we do with this data now, given the approaches that we've seen? So what I've argued in my work is that this seems to force us to depart a bit from current approaches. So the first generalization, so the fact that we have early CP structures, favors, in particular, continuity approaches to some extent, and maybe potentially the Friedman and colleague approach if only the left peripherally low CP structures are early. But generalization 2 tells us that the stronger version, which is that it's only the left periphery lower CP structures that are early, doesn't seem to be correct because we've got early topics, we've got early complementizers, so that therefore we have to potentially not follow the kind of growing trees logic for this data. And then the third generalization is this idea, well, we have evidence to be saying that the CP is early structures providing us evidence for the CP are early in a way that seems productive, and they use a lot of them. But we don't have any evidence to be saying that the kids can make use of more than one day until a later stage, and they do so very abruptly. So it's not like they gradually acquire this ability; they go from having none of them to all of them. So how do we account for this basically? I propose that retaining this notion of fixed granularity is potentially what is causing us some empirical problems, which is if you retain this notion of fixed granularity, either you say, to capture the early CP structures, either you say, we've got all the cartography there, in which case we overgenerate because we don't have space. Well, we have all the space to be generating the split CP structures, which are not produced until later, or you undergenerate, which is you either have to say that the earlier CP structures are not very productive, and the cartography, the full CP is acquired later. So we typically assume too much structure for the data that we see. So what I propose here is that it may be better to make sense of this data if we capitalize on approaches that take the richness of functional structure to be something that varies, and the kids that have to acquire it to some extent. And so I'm going to take this, as I said, this comes back to Giorgio and Pianesi's feature scattering idea. but there's a lot of work that has been proposed here. So Martina Veshko, notably, Bogolek and Trenchon, so there's a lot of people that have suggested this. Very definitely not the first one. And the more innovative bit is to say, well, this is something that is reflected in language acquisition. What we see in language acquisition might be that kids may have to be working out this structure. So this is the proposal. The idea is, this is based on a hypothesis that Teresa Vivaro and Ian Roberts speculated on, but they didn't test empirically, which is that one possibility is that categories might actually become more fine-grained as the kid gets older, such that we first have a more coarser-grained understanding of, I can move something to a C position in my language. So there's a head in my language that locates discourse or pragmatically motivated things, but I don't yet have an understanding that, oh, my language I have to acquire that my language can have more than one position, each of which is reserved to, say, topics or complementizers, etc. Right? So the way I implemented this would very helpfully, summarize it. This idea is a strand of approaches to generative syntax that basically says, it follows the idea by Chomsky that has suggested that third factors might play an important role in language, or at least more so than how much we think is in universal grammar. So the idea is to take, there is a universal grammar, it's the same kind of, we use the same kind of minimalist tools that syntacticians work with, but it might not have as much of a rich inventory as typically has been assumed. So it might have merge, maybe agree, maybe some notion of formal features. But for what I'm going to be saying today, I'm going to assume that there's no such thing as an innate set of cartographic categories. They might have some template for categories. Some people have suggested that, but at least not a universal, very rich functional spine. And the hypothesis that they suggest is, well, all of these is that, well, something like cartography might be a way of looking at one empirical phenomenon, which is the CP domain, at a very specific, fine-grained lens, and might actually not be incompatible with having a very basic CP. And so the idea is that the different kinds of levels of granularity that we see across frameworks, so say a more minimalist CP versus a cartographic CP, might not actually be incompatible, but might actually reflect the potential learning path. Because the kids might start off with first saying, I have a C head, before they realize, oh, I have to split it because I'm acquiring Italian, and I get evidence from the input that I can't just make do with one C. And the idea is that the lower you go, so they do this kind of emergent categorial hierarchy. The details don't matter, but the idea is that the lower you go in the hierarchy and the finer grains the categories get, the more features that the kid needs to be acquiring. So here, the kid needs to be saying there's a head with a C feature, so I know there's a C domain in my language, but at a later stage, the kid needs to be saying, oh, there's a head that has a force feature, there's a head that has a topic feature, so they have to be acquiring more and more features and associating with them with different heads, basically. And so the idea is that the lower you go, the harder this is, because the kids need to be acquiring more stuff. And we sort of see this reflected in the production data in the sense that the kids initially just have one slot, but then when they start producing them, we at the very least see a division between the left things in the split CP structures tend to be topics, and the things towards the right tend to be more like focus on double H elements. So they know that there's a place where the topics go, and there's a place where the double H elements go. So we see things like questo dove si mette, which we have a topic and then a double H element, so they know there's two locations at least for topics and then for foci, and these go in this specific order. So they don't really mix them up. And here we have a complementizer, which is always before the WH element. So at this point, the kids seem to be knowing I can make use of two slots, each of which hosts different elements, right? And sometimes they even produce three things, which tend to be two topics or a topic. So in Spanish, they say something like, ahora todos los muchachos, ¿a dónde se van a ir? Which is something like, now, all the boys, where are they going to? So sometimes you see three, but this is rare. And that's not to say that they don't have three heads, it's just to say that the kids might not produce all the data or need to test how many heads they have. But the point is that when they start producing them, at the very least, they show evidence for two of these heads. So, okay, this is the proposal, so that the CP gets finer grained. Yes, okay, I'm just checking the time. The CP gets fine. Yeah, no, I've timed it, I should have enough time. So I've given you this idea that so I've given you basically what is a representational account of the data that I've given you, right? So whatever is going on in the patterns is something that is in the grammar. The grammar has changed somehow. But you might say there's a range of alternatives that you might think of it here, which is that there's a range of confounds which have nothing to do with grammar that might be explaining why the split CP structures are laid. And so we want to at least look into them, because otherwise the data might just be showing us something that is completely different to what we think it is. And then I'm going to talk about 4 superficially plausible alternatives that might be relevant here. But for all of which I'm going to say that I don't think there's enough evidence to be saying that these explain the data. So one of them, you might think, well, the split CP structures are making the kid produce one more word in the left periphery. Could it not be that because they have to say more words, and we know the kids earlier, they don't say many words, could it be that the more words they have to say, the less likely it is that they produce them? So I ran a mixed effects model here, which basically asks the model, I've given you a sample of each of the diagnostics, and I've given you the age at which the kids produce them, and how many words each of the diagnostics has. Can you predict the age at which every structure is going to be produced based only on how long the sentences are, as opposed to whether they're CP or split CP? And the answer is no. The only thing that predicts it is the length of individual diagnostics is not a predictor. So you can have CP diagnostics that have more words than split CP diagnostics, because, for example, the sentences here, they actually don't have that many words. So sometimes you have CP structures that have more. So it's not always the case that the CP structures actually have more length. So another one would be, well, split CP structures sometimes involve 2 steps of movement. So the topic and a duration element, for example. So you might say, some people have suggested, like Jakovich, that the more you move, the harder it is for the kid. But for this data, this is not predictive enough, because there's a range of CP structures that involve split CP structures that involve phase generation, like when they have complementizers, which are typically not assumed to be moved. And then we also have CP structures that involve 2 steps of movement. So Germanic topics involve movement of the XP to the specifier of CP and movement of the verb to C. So if this were just about movement, this should be hard, and it's not. So durational economy as such is not going to help us too much. Another option is intervention effects, so it has been proposed that kids struggle in particular when you've got 2 movement dependencies going on, and the object ends up higher than the subject, because the kids don't know anymore what is the object and what is the subject, so it's hard to keep track. So they don't have the usual SVO order. Now the object is before the subject, and this is hard for the kids. What it turns out here, so this is found in object-related questions, that they're hard for the kid to produce and understand, relative clauses as well. What we find here is that the majority of the split CP structures that are late actually don't have these configurations. The topic is typically a subject. So things like this one. Well, no, this one is not a good example, but something like John, where John is the subject and the derivation element is a temporal one. So it's not the case that the configurations that are late are always these ones. The majority of them are not. So we can't be saying that this is because the changes in word order are going to be tricky for the kid. And another option would be input frequency. I can tell you that these structures are very frequent in the input because I have the data, but I'll discuss this more briefly in a sec. So now for the later part, I'm going to continue with having said that these accounts don't seem to explain the whole data set, I'm going to continue with the optimistic assumption or intuition that there might be something grammatical going on here. And so what I'm going to do next is to zoom in more into this generalization that these structures are late, and then see, is there any ways in which we can tease apart this kinds of approaches that assume fixed versus flexible granularity? I'm going to try to show you that maybe in bilingualism we see another evidence for it. And this is going to be a shorter part. So I'm going to mostly, for time reasons, going to mostly skim through some of it, but I've sort of argued that I'm going to follow an approach which takes the CP domain and its structure to be something that varies across languages. And there's empirical evidence for it, right? So for example, Germanic languages don't move much. You can only typically have one thing before the verb. Romance languages are the extreme, right? So you can typically have 3, 4 things in the left periphery without any problems. And there's languages that are somewhere in the middle, right? And so people have said, people have asked the question, how are we going to capture all of this? And there's a range of ways you can answer this question, but the perspective that I'm going to take is that it seems increasingly unlikely that that this one fine-grained functional sequence, both empirically and conceptually. And there's been a range of evidence for it that I'm not going to go through. But taking this perspective, which is what I've done so far, we have to come up with another way of capturing the fact that we've got languages that have a very rich CP. So we have to incorporate the cross-graphic insight somehow. We can't just lose them without necessarily committing to the fact that, say, German has a very rich CP, because we don't see evidence for German having different heads, or at least overtly moving things to the left periphery as much. And so there's a range of, as I said, the first approach is suggested. This is not the notion of features capturing and bundling. I've used the more emergent approach here, which I think are very similar, but they make some different predictions. But just so you know what the feature scattering approaches say, all of these approaches basically say the kid starts off with a single C head, and the feature scattering approaches said the C head comes with a set of formal features that is universal. What the kids have to learn is whether these features stay in the same C head, and that's where all of the things can be moved, or whether they can scatter them and say there's a head that only hosts topic features, a head that only hosts a focus features, so whether the features stay in one head or they scatter them. So this would be the idea. So for example, you can either have a more bundled CP, like in English, where most of the features stay in one place, and so you can only move one or two things. Whereas in North Sicilian, the kids have to scatter it more because you can move more things. That's the idea. But under these approaches, which exist in the literature and have been used more and more, we make one important prediction for development, which is, the richer the functional structure is, the later it should be acquired, because the kids have to be deviating from the kind of innate, or maybe not innate, idea that the default idea that my CP domain is squished or bundled. And then they have to realize that they have to expand it, right? So one additional unexplored research question that we can ask here is, if we force, but if we have two kids that are acquiring two languages with very different CP structures, so a richer or a coarser grained one, do we expect any language contact effects? Is that going to affect how the kids develop their peripheries? And I'm going to show you that we get cross-linguistic effects, but only in some cases. So I'm going to give you evidence I'm going to go back to the Romance bilinguals. So I had Catalan and Spanish bilinguals, and I'm going to give you evidence from bilinguals acquiring Germanic and Romance, so acquiring German and Italian, or German and Spanish, and I'm going to show you that we get different patterns there. And that we can predict them if we have some notion of what the structure of the CP is. So yeah, that's just what I said. It's basically the same study, but done with Germanic and Romance bilinguals. I'm going to compare the CP structures to the split CP structures, see how they differ from the Catalan and Spanish bilinguals. So that's just the data. I got 8 bilinguals acquiring 1 Germanic and 1 Romance language. The majority are German and Italian because they're from the Natasha Müller corpus, but I added more that I could find in Childers to expand the data set. And one is German and Spanish, one is Dutch Italian, and one is English and Spanish. And most of them are balanced bilinguals, this is important because we want to make sure that we don't have a kid that speaks a lot more Italian than they speak German, with one exception that is Aula, that I'm going to talk about in a second. And I'm going to use initials for data protection reasons of the kids in this case. So yeah, this is the idea. It's the same methodology that I've seen before, and I'm not only going to talk about the Romance data here. I don't have time to talk about the Germanic data, but what I'm going to ask here is, how do they develop their knowledge of the CP in the Romance languages of the various bilinguals? So this is what I showed you earlier, right? So you're familiar with this. The green structures are laid in both the monolinguals and the bilinguals. This is what you find in the bilinguals, which is very similar, right? So the derived questions are early. In some cases, the illocutory complementars as well, and some cases the topics and first. And embedding is a bit late. There's not much that is different here. Sometimes you see illocutory complementars as being a bit late, you will know. That's not surprising. Italian barely makes use of these things. So they're not very common in the input. You should only, the ones that we expect to be early acquired are, for instance, this kid is Spanish, he produces them a lot earlier than others. So the triangles are a bit more variable because the language is different, how much they use them. So if we add the split CP structures now, we get a relatively similar picture, right? Which is more or less when you get embedding, you get the green stuff. So if you look just at age of emergence, the 2 bilinguals, so the Germanic Romance ones, and the other ones are very similar, right? So the green things are relatively late. But if we look at the quantitative data, we find that the rate at which they produce these structures is different, such that the kids acquiring Germanic and Romance languages are struggling a lot more than the kids acquiring 2 Romance languages. So what I've given you here is I've basically taken as the baseline how often do the Romance bilinguals, so the Catalan and Spanish bilinguals, produce these structures, and then compared it to what the Germanic Romance bilinguals produce, so the rate of production, how higher or lower is the rate of production of the Germanic Romance bilinguals. And so what you see here is that they underproduce a lot the split CP structures by more than 50%, whereas the other ones, these are not significantly different, this one is, the other ones are just more or less produced at the same rate. So in other words, they're selectively underproducing one of the diagnostics that I have in my data set, but not the others. So yeah, this is just what I said. These are not significant. This one is statistically significant. So the split CP structures are somehow underproduced. They struggle to produce these structures. And if you compare it with the monolinguals, the Romance bilinguals are not significant, not different from the monolinguals. The bilinguals are different from every other. they're much lower in how much they produce this. And these are obviously normalized to account for those differences. But and if I go back to the L-shaped curves that we had earlier, so these are the monolinguals and the romance bilinguals, we have these L-shaped curves. The other ones have a hill, basically. So they sort of develop these structures, but they don't actually, that they are aware that these structures exist, but they don't really develop them at the same rate as the others. The one exception is this kid, notably. But if you remember, this is the kid that is unbalanced towards Italian. So he rarely uses German until age 3. So it is interesting that the one kid that doesn't have much influence from his German, at least in his grammar, is the one developing these structures more. The other ones they sort of stagnate a bit. So they know these structures are there, but they don't really produce them. And then I'm going to skip this, but this only shows that I might as well just talk about it briefly. This only shows that the Germanic Romance bilinguals actually move topics on their own and not in conjunction with other CP structures, just on their own, a lot more than the Romance bilinguals, which typically prefer them in things like Julia, where is she, where you have a topic and a double German, whereas the Germanic Romance bilinguals refuse to stick the topics together with double elements, but they're very happy to move them on their own. Plausibly because of B2 in German, but at the very least, this shows these kids have no problems with moving topics or frontiering objects, but they have problems with sticking them together with other CP structures. This is where the problem seems to be. So we have some underproduction that it selectively targets only one set of diagnostics, the split CP ones, and only in some bilinguals, so not all. This is not just about bilingualism, it's about which language pairs we have. So the main things here to take into account is that the main one is that this can't be because of a notion of reduced input. So it can't be the case that what is going on here. Well, there's obviously a role of input here. The Germanic and Romance bilinguals are receiving a lot less Romance data than the Romance bilinguals. But if this were a case of whatever I'm less used to hearing, I produce less, why do they not underproduce, I don't know, WH questions or embedding or the things that are also reduced in the input, everything else is reduced. And in fact, the frequency of these structures is very similar in both of those data. So they get a very similar frequency of these structures in both of the acquired groups. So I suggest that the relevant factors here seem to be, I've put a Germanic and a Romance language together. Somehow now this makes me struggle with the split CP structures, whereas if I'm acquiring two Romance languages, I don't really have a problem. And what is going wrong here is that there's something inherently difficult about these split CP structures in a way that mirrors what we saw in part 1, right? So what I suggest is that maybe we could think of it as a case of you might get influence of cross-linguistic influence between bilinguals if you put together a kid acquiring a language where the CP is much simpler and a language where the CP is much richer, such that the CP that is much simpler is kind of influencing the richer one because that one is harder to acquire. And so the direction goes in the way that we've got a CP that it has to be acquired that is more complex, but the kid has a bias to they ideally prefer to acquire simpler things. So they have more evidence to not split the CP basically. And this might be a case of what's called underdevelopment in bilingualism. So a well-known thing in bilingualism is that when kids either haven't acquired something or they've sort of partially acquired it, but not quite, they don't like producing it. So they avoid producing it in production data, which is more or less what we seem to be seeing here, which is that they know these structures exist, but they don't like producing them. And so this is the hypothesis, and I very much welcome feedback here, but I think, unless I'm mistaken, I think this is a hypothesis that is unique to this approach, in the sense that if we assume an approach where the whole structure is there, the difference, we can't capture the differences here in terms of movement, which I discussed about here. It's a case of how much structure are we needing to put together in the CP domain. And so this seems only to follow if grammatical construction cares about this notion of how elaborate is my CP, as opposed to do I have to move one thing or two things, as I discussed earlier. So yeah, this is just a summary of what I just said, but the idea is that with the Germanic and Romance bilinguals, they have more evidence to be keeping a simple CP in their German, which is influenced, and less evidence in the input they should say split, to split their CP because they have less Romance input. So that might be encouraging their Romance CP to be staying more basic than the other ones. And this is just another case study that basically shows that what is going on here is not so much about, is there a parallel in this structure in my other L1? So does my other language have this same structure or not? Because we have structures that don't have a parallel in German, and they are not underproduced. And a case of this is the illocutory complementizers that I discussed. So these ones They do exist in German, but they don't really exist in the input as far as I've seen, and they're not produced early by the German kids, which is, we've seen the illusory complementizers. These ones are not obviously underproduced in the relevant comparison. So if you take, recall that the Germanic Romance bilinguals are mostly Italian. Italian produces less of these complementizers, so we shouldn't compare these guys that have Catalan and Spanish, because obviously we get different rates. But if you compare these groups that do have Italian and that have also Catalan and Spanish, but Italian and other languages, we get a mean and a median that is relatively similar. So the ranges are relatively similar. So you've got some kids reaching around 1.1 normalized, compared to the monolinguals, which also reach, similar ranges. Obviously, the Catalan and Spanish bilinguals are doing something very different, but that is expected because in Catalan and Spanish we use these ones a lot more than in Italian. So this might be evidence to say, well, what is going on here is not so much I don't have this structure in my German or my Dutch. It's more of a case of I can't fit the structure that I'm acquiring, the split CP structures, in my current CP structure. So these complementizers, you can fit them in a CP structure because you only need a C head. But the split CP structures require you to be splitting the C. And this is something I'll stop here because I don't have time. But one question that we might want to ask is, I show you that these structures are not delayed in the sense that in the graph that I showed you, they're acquired more or less at the same time, and it just shows to produce them. One speculation might be that they produce them, but how they produce them might not be yet fully adult-like, because they don't seem to develop them as much as the others. So just so that I can wrap up and you can ask me questions. So if we go back to this notion of fixed granularity, with the bilinguals, we seem to go back to the same issue as in the first study, which is how do we explain that only the structures that require a more elaborate CP are affected, and only if you have Germanic Romance bilingual sets, not any kind of bilingual and not any kind of monolingual, right? So just to summarize, so I've tried to give you some corpus data and developmental data that sort of shows if we take this new idea that is, it exists, but we have to take granularity not as something that we take for granted because of our theory, but something that we should be studying as well, irrespective of which theory we follow, really. We make a range of new untestable predictions, which I've tried to probe, at least as a first case study of this. One is, if we do this, we spot, well, CP structures are early, but also there are kind of CP structures that are more articulated that don't seem to be early. And these ones seem to be making reference to a more articulated CP. And also the generalization seems to manifest differently across populations in a way that is interesting. So you only get underproduction in some, but not all bilinguals, in a way that might be predictable depending on which kinds of languages are coming into contact. And I've argued that we might anticipate why these structures, the split CP ones, are idiosyncratic developmentally, and why this matters with respect to the bilinguals pairs if we think that categories are something that the structure of the categories and functional sequences varies across languages, and if this matters in language acquisition, right? If this plays a role as well. So a lot of future directions that you can do here with other acquirers and L2 acquisition, attrition, and heritage speakers, but just for the sake of keeping it short, that's all I have to say. This is very much work in progress. The bilingual stuff is very new, so I very much welcome any feedback or questions that you have. So thank you very much.
Yeah, perfectly on time. And thank you, Núria, for this exciting presentation. I mean, it was very clear, but I'm sure there will be some questions or comments. Please.
Yeah, any questions?
We can start maybe with the colleagues connected by the Zoom room.
Can I ask a question? So thank you so much for the presentation. I also think that it was very clear and I mean, full of interesting details concerning the development of left periphery. So what I was thinking while you were presenting the data is actually, okay, if we assume that the left periphery is sort of collapsed in the early stages of acquisition. Then, I mean, following the lead of Giorgi and Pianesi, we have to assume that there is a bundle of features that is not an unordered bundle, but you have to assume that it is an array of bundle, and so children acquiring the granularity of the CP also acquire that this array is ordered in some way.
Yeah.
So the point is, I mean, this is a very broad question, not just as something that I'm thinking out loud. So basically, what's the difference between cartography and an approach that assumes that you have a bundle of features that is order that is an order array, basically?
No, this is a great point. So this is a problem I personally have this is the reason why I haven't implemented it with feature scattering at the moment, because you do indeed have to assume that the ordered set of features has to be innate somehow, unless they can acquire it, right? I mean, I guess the difference what the featuring scattering approaches would say, well, the difference is that the unique C head with the feature bundle just says you can move all of these features to this head, but nowhere else. Whereas if you scatter them, you can now say, well, this head, you have to move the topic on this. So the difference would be how structurally scattered, I guess, or expanded the left periphery is, right? But I agree, like it makes it, there's a range of questions that you can ask, which is, well, if now we have an innate ordered array, does this mean that kids have the notion of topic feature from the earliest ages? What does that predict? So that's the reason why, instead of assuming that the features are there, I'm assuming that the kids have to be working out this head hosts this feature and have to acquire it. So that's why I've not done the feature scattering way. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so a residual issue that is still with I think all of these approaches, but I think it's a general issue for any kind of approach, even cartography, is to understand where the ordering comes from, right? Even if it's innate, the question is still, why do topics precede focus generally, or why do complementarities typically precede topics? I take that to be a general issue that I think is a bit of a big question that arises in any approach. Yeah, but yeah, thank you. Yeah.
No, thank you. I mean, I perfectly agree. So basically, I mean, it's a very broad question concerning the scattering of feature and how you actually conceive of the CP. And I think your tree concerning, I mean, when you have those paired trees, English and Italian, I mean, you can actually see that. I mean, you just have one position in English, and possibly you just can topicalize something or focalize something, but not both at the same time.
Yeah.
So this is strong evidence, I guess, for.
That's the reasoning, which is that if you assume the whole tree, then for languages like English, which it's not. I mean, English is not so much that it does it infrequently. At least the speakers that have been consulted in the literature that I've consulted, it's ungrammatical to be putting them together. So it's not just the case of, oh, it's infrequent, it's just I can't, it's a case of like my grammar doesn't allow it. So if we have the whole structure, we have to ask the question of why is it that some languages refuse to do this? So yeah, that's the idea. But yeah, I mean, I'm sort of also thinking about the scattering thing, because I think we might make different predictions. So while they're very similar, I think there's some little areas where we might make different predictions because of the array of feature bundles that is already there. But yes, thank you. I agree very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we have a question by Teresa Guasti, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very sympathetic with the idea, also because in a few days I have to comment on Rizzi's paper on cartographic. And so I have 3 comments. One is at least force P should be available very early, because children produce at the time they produce declarative, also imperative.
Yes.
In the growing tree hypothesis, it is assumed that imperative are very low, so at the level of the VP. But if you don't assume that force P is there, it means that children produce sentences without a meaning, which I think it's a bit strange. So at least something higher must be there. The second observation is if you extend your approach to DPs and this concerns the cross-linguistic variation, you can see that you can find a stage in which children don't produce article only in Germanic languages, or better, I don't know all Germanic languages, but certainly I think German and English, this is what I look at. while you don't find such a stage in Italian, for example. No, it was not German, but it was Dutch, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, but I get the idea,
Yeah, so, and finally, if you look at comprehension, which is a prediction that the growing tree hypothesis makes in one paper, in fact, relative clauses and WH questions are understood by 20 months of age.
The subject ones.
No, also the object.
Oh, those are the object ones. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of that yet.
As measured by eye tracking. Okay. And in any case, for comprehension, you have to admit that children have at least the full structure, maybe less detailed, but otherwise, how can they comprehend a question at all?
Okay, yes. Okay, so this is very interesting. I guess I'll go one comment by one. So the first comment about the imperatives, that I guess the growing trees logic is forced to rethink that if what they have to do is say, well, post is not available, therefore it might be somewhere else like FinP. But besides the problems that you've mentioned, I think another problem would be that if we allow this logic, then any counterexample to the generalization can just be put somewhere else in the tree, right? Because the tree is there. So similarly with the complementarities, you might say maybe the complementarities are in FinP. But then the point of the cartographic logic is that because the structure is innate, the kids should be entertaining more or less adult-like analysis. So why would they locate the imperatives of FinP and then what is the input that would force every analysis is the other question, right? So yes, I'm very much agree with that. For the DPs, that's very interesting. I wasn't aware of that stage, and I will look into it. If you have the papers, I would be very interested in seeing which ones these are.
The paper are published in some journal. It's on Catalan, Dutch, Italian.
Okay, I'll look into it.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and about the comprehension, yes. Okay, I didn't know that. I thought that the consensus was that object relatives were harder, but I didn't realize that they were actually comprehended in eye tracking a lot earlier than we thought. So that's very interesting. But yes, I agree. I mean, there's a lot of questions that you can ask with comprehension. And there's also work that has shown in French that topics are early comprehended as well in 21 months. So that's also a problem. I mean, one thing I would have to do with this project, but I think it's quite hard to test, would be the predictions we make with this approach for comprehension. I haven't done that yet because I think that's harder to test. But you might want to test, I guess, intervention effect or something like that in children, but you need very young kids because these structure sentences are produced at around 2 or 3, so you need kids younger than 3, which is not easy. Yeah. But yeah. So yes, I very much agree. Thank you for the comment. I'll look into what you've mentioned.
Okay, thank you so much. Our questions or comments?
Maybe a quick one. I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but when you look at the complexity in the acquisition of these CP structures, does the degree of structural adjustment of certain elements which are placed in the CP play some kind of role? Because I'm kind of thinking, for example, about the different types of topics and the kind of, in Italian at least, the kind of morphological or morphosyntactic strategies that are required to mark them as such. Yeah. So, for example, clitic left dislocation, the fact that you require a certain clitic to. So, and also as far as foci are concerned, the contrastive foci require special prosodic marking compared to regular foci. Yeah. Does this play a role?
Yeah. So I wish I could give you a full answer because I would have required a lot of data analysis. I don't have this much data analysis done, but I can give you some things that I do know. So clitic left dislocation is harder for the kids. So a lot of the topics that you see at early stages are in the split CP structures are subject topics. So things like John, where has she gone, where the clitic is not there. And clitic left dislocation, even on its own without split CP structures, is also hard to find. Generally also, even if, so split CP structures where the topic is an object, they're hard to find as well, which is not necessarily surprising because people have argued that these are harder to comprehend. But yes, so there's a role potentially for more complexity of clitic left dislocation. As for the different topics and contrastive foci, I don't know. There's a lot of analysis that will need to be done there. There's also problems, which is it's often hard even to interpret whether the kid even means a topic or a foci, let alone if that's a contrastive focus or a narrow focus or something else. So I guess it would be good maybe to do this with comprehension potentially, because you can play with.
I'm more familiar with L2 acquisition data, but I know that in other frameworks, what you see is that the initial positioning of topical material does not pose a particular problem. It's actually more of a natural kind of positioning because of this was pragmatic reasoning, but then you struggle with the morphological marking, or you struggle with the, let's say, structural dimension of what that kind of positioning requires. I'm not sure if I...
I mean, one thing I do remember, I don't remember the details, but I do know Vincenzo Moscati that look at different kinds of topics and different kinds of foci. And I think he found in comprehension that the more fine-grained kinds of topics, I can't remember if it was contrastive focus or other kinds of topics. Anyway, some of the finer-grained ones were harder for the kids to integrate in his comprehension experiment, but I don't remember the details. I don't know from my data. Partly because I'm very wary of reading too much into the data, because it's hard to know what kind of topic it is in the child data.
Yes, of course.
Especially if the context is not helpful.
If you have to judge that from an information structure point of view, it's a terrible.
I don't always have the prosody either, so but it would be great to do that in a little experiment. Thank you. But it's one of the questions I really want to ask. Besides the topic feature, are like more complex kinds of topics harder to encode? I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Maybe I have a very general question about a whole idea. I mean, I'm very, very sympathetic with the idea that the house is built up from the roof. And not.
Okay.
I'm very sympathetic with this idea, because I think that in a part-whole system, you need the idea of whole in order to segment the single parts. Nevertheless, there was a very old suggestion that maybe, I mean, I don't know with the Catalan complementizer and Spanish complementizer very high, but I mean, the WH marker are generated in the VP and then moved to CP. And I mean, a very old idea was that maybe the VP, and it would be connected with the idea that you need a plus minus V in order to construct some part-whole systems with the minus N, the noun and the verb. But that maybe the WH markers generated in the VP are not really moved to the CP, but realized in a spot, let's say in a slot before the VP, just for movement, just for. It's just a suggestion.
I've thought of that. So I mean, there's been a lot of work that has also said that maybe V2 might not be in the CP, might be in an FP or some other kind of functional projection. So I guess. So I'll be happier to allow this kind of analysis if the only kind of CP structure that is I see early on were WH questions. If say WH questions were special and being particularly early, then maybe I could think about what are these doing something else rather than. But also I don't know, they seem productive. I mean, in German and Dutch they have a V2 order as well. So in German, I think for Germanic it's a lot harder to get away with not having the CP. For Romance, maybe you can, but the problem is, I also don't, so just like I don't have evidence to be saying that they're, at least like, I can't see whether they are in the tree. I also can't see that they're not in the tree. So I guess the simplest assumption is to assume this might be adult-like. But yes, I mean, a possibility would be that. I don't know how you'd actually exceed that apart is the problem. I mean, maybe if there, you might also want to ask questions here about what is the inflection of the British questions like? Because if they always, a generalization is that you don't find root infinitives, or at least not very often in the British context. So if they moved somewhere higher than the VP, they would have to be above the TP. So then at that point, you know, saying that they're generated above the TP but not in CP, I don't know whether that's any different from saying.
As I said,
no, it's
I
not.
mean, I very connected with the idea that the CP is there, but just as
it's an exercise.
counter-argument.
No, I'm familiar with
idea. But I think you're right. The Germanic data show very clearly.
The Germanic data is
CP
particularly hard to.
Should be there.
Should be I think Romance data is well easier. It's a bit more ambiguous, but Germanic data, once the E2 is once you have topics that immediately have to have the verb, and these topics are not always subjects, because some data has argued that subject, so SVO order in Germanic is not necessarily in the CP domain, it might just be in TP. Some people argue that even for adult German or other languages, but the kids are also producing objects on adverbial. So at that point, once you see things that show a very clear V2 order, unless you have a really weird analysis of what that is, which will be a stipulation, you can't really get away with not saying it's a CP. But so the rich, I'm familiar with these arguments. You have to think about them, or at least argue against them. But I'm not convinced that it's
of course, and you need evidence also for a structure in which eventually the WH is realized in the PP.
There has to be some kind of change, right? And I'm not sure I see a change between the different kinds of storage questions.
Thank you. Okay, then there are no more questions, I think. Okay, thank you, Núria, very much.
Thank you for being here. And thank you for people that joined online and the questions.
Thank you. We get the announcement for next week.
All right, so you're all invited to our next lab meeting, which is on the 5th of June, which is next week, and next Friday, in which Gianluca Cosentino of the University of Cagliari and Daniela Sorrentino of the University of Calabria will present a talk with the title Produzione testuale supportata dall'IA nell'insegnamento del tedesco come lingua straniera, uno studio empirico con apprendenti universitari italofoni di livello intermedio. See you next week.
Okay.